So it is good to see everybody here this morning. We're going to continue with our study in the book of words, the book of Deuteronomy. We are in chapter 12. Again, just over on the other side of the river, waiting to go in. Moses is doing some preaching and delivering what is called the second law, or the second time the law is given, and making sure that they're locked in with this concept of being obedient to God, making sure that they're understanding that this is something that they need to take seriously before they go into this promised land. You just can't go all willy-nilly with God and then die over there too, like some people that they might have known did in the wilderness. So we're trying to be very serious. Moses is trying to make sure that they're understanding this relationship that they have with God, and delivering in this message. In chapter 12, we're going to begin something a little bit different. We've seen things and repeated some things that we've seen in the past. We've talked about what happened in the past. We've talked about things they needed to remember, things that they'd seen with their own eyes. You've heard these things. Remember. And in chapter 12, we're going to start some things that they need to keep in mind when they're in this new land. And so we're going to begin looking at some laws and some things. And so we may actually go through this material a little more quickly than we had in the past. We'll see. I've said that before. So we'll see how this goes. So chapter 12, we begin this sort of a section where we're still on that the second major lesson or second major discourse for Moses. But at this point, we're given sort of new laws from Canaan, some things that they need to consider when they're in the land of Canaan. And chapter 12 begins with some worship laws, some things that they need to consider when they're worshiping God. And he says in verse 1, "These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land." You've heard that before, right? He said that a few times in this book already. And he begins to talk about how they need to utterly destroy pagan worship in verses 1 through 4. They need to utterly destroy it. And he says, "You shall not act like this," in verse 4, "you shall not act like this toward the Lord your God." Talking about destroying their sacred pillars. You need to destroy all their sacred things, but don't do this to God. Don't act this way to God. And so verses 5 through 14 tells us that God would designate the place of worship. So verses 1 through 4, he says, you need to destroy all their high places, all their places of worship. Almost under every green tree, they have some sort of shrine. You need to destroy all of those things. And if you're going into a land to take over, and he says you need to destroy them to the fact that they've been forgotten. They've been forgotten. Is how utterly destructive you need to be against those pagan gods. Why would they give that kind of instruction to these people? So they won't go back. It seems like this group of people, they're quick to jump on a different bandwagon, right? At least, he said that they're stubborn people. And remember when Moses was gone just 40 days up on the mountain? What were they quick to do? Make an idol. It just happened. I just threw it in the fire and it popped out. Remember, that's what Aaron was saying. And so he said, you need to utterly destroy all these things that could possibly be worshipped and distract you. He says in the New American Standard, obliterate their name from the place. So when you obliterate something, I think there's like dust left maybe of whatever that item was. So they need to be obliterated. In verse 5 he says, "But you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all their tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come." And so, again, God will establish how he will be worshipped to the point of where he will be worshipped. God will establish that. And it's interesting that in this chapter, there are some phrases. You have this emphasis on their gods and your God, an emphasis on their name and his name in relationship to the difference between the two, the pagan versus true worship in this chapter. And he says here, you will destroy, you worship, and don't do it like they do, but follow the place that the Lord your God will choose. And he goes on talking about bringing your offerings at that place. And in verse 8, he says, you shall not do at all what you are doing here today, every man doing what is right in his own eyes. If you've read Old Testament history, every man doing what is right in his own eyes. Does that sound familiar to any other part of history? Today, maybe. So do we get to that point? If I said the word judges, there was no king in the land, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. That was not good for the people of Israel to do that. Judges chapter 17, verse 6, and Judges 21:25 both repeat this phrase, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. And we saw that gets them in trouble when they do that. And they don't focus on what God has prescribed and how God has prescribed and where God has prescribed. And that translates for us today in that God has said, this is how I will be worshiped. And this is when I will be worshiped. And this is the way that I will be worshiped. And so we just can't do whatever we want. There's a lot of, again, this principle of respect and awe and sanctity when we come to worship God that must be maintained. Yes, we have freedoms in Christ. Yes, we have grace. But you still can't approach the Creator of this world just any old way. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't see God changing that way. And God doesn't change, but as far as, from Old Testament to New Testament, He's still to be revered. And so, and this principle also needs to be taken into account when we come to worship God. An interesting comment also was made in verse 13. It says, be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses, in one of your tribes, where you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. Why would you not start offering your burnt offerings in the places where they used to do their burnt offering? They weren't clean. There's this concept of cleanliness, of something that, we saw earlier that God was supposed to choose where they were supposed to be worshipped. How about just mixing the religious concepts? You're supposed to be a holy people. You don't just go in and start doing things the way they do it or doing things the where they did it. You don't want to mix this concept of how you're supposed to worship and where you're supposed to worship. And so there was no mixing or blending, which is popular when you have two cultures coming together or a people coming in. They're supposed to just obliterate. They're supposed to, and you'll see later on that they don't quite do that. And so when they said they're supposed to be completely different in that respect. Verses 15 through 28, we have just sort of the ordinary meal. We won't read all of this, but the concept of ordinary meals and then ceremonial meals. Why would that be important? And so he begins talking about where you can, when you can kill things and eat them, and then the things that are supposed to be sacred to God, you're supposed to eat them at certain places and eat them with everybody and share them. And the blood is to be spilt and not to be eaten. It's to be poured out on the ground like water. And so he goes into this concept of when and where you are to eat ordinary meals. And, you can kill your own stuff and eat it in your own house when you want to. But the ceremonial things are supposed to be eaten in a certain way, a specific place, and with everybody included. And so the ceremonial things, it was a family event. Everybody was included. Even the servants of the house were included in that meal, in that event. So that's 15 through 28. We won't take the time to read that, but that is, again, in verse 28, he says, be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, that it may be well with you. And again, this over and over and over and over again, that concept is stressed in the book of Deuteronomy. Again, verse 29 through 32, this last part of chapter 12, you must not copy the pagan people. Verses 29 through 32. And, You've ever seen somebody do something and say, oh, that looks kind of neat. That'd be kind of fun. That looks like that feels more religious. You can't copy them. You can't do what they're doing. What does it say here that they're doing? He says he's going to cut off the nations. And he says, beware in verse 30 that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you. Which is really a weird concept. You're going to come in and destroy these people and then adopt their gods that were supposed to protect them? Does that make sense? The gods that they were praying to defeat you, and you just conquered them, and you're going to adopt the ones that failed? It doesn't make sense. But he says here, you shall not behave thusward, the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Remember earlier when the Lord said that I am destroying them not because you are so righteous, and I've picked you to come in and destroy them not because you're so righteous, but because they're so wicked. This is what he's putting down here. This is an example of their wickedness. They're offering their sons and their daughters to the fires of Moloch, to the fires of their gods. Is that happening today? Not by fire. Abortions. Are we offering up children, sons and daughters to the god of convenience? Are we offering up our sons and daughters to the foreign gods? Worshipping self, or doing other things that would, that kind of hits home when we start thinking about offering children. We don't do that. We're not as bad as they are. And I realize, preaching to the choir here, but as a nation, we are doing this very same thing. But it's polished over, and it's not really seen as much. And from what we understand from their cultic worships, they've started off with the atmosphere, and they're beating their drums and that kind of stuff, so that you don't hear the cries of the child that's in the fire. And so all that's drowned out, all that's done away with, so you just get this experience of offering. And the same thing today, people sweep it under the rug, and they do it in certain places so that we don't see how horrible it really is. Yes, ma'am.
It's almost like these people were really followers. They weren't leaders, they were followers. When one person does something, they all follow along.
Mm-hmm.
Afraid to do what was right on their own. They were just followers.
Yes. Yeah, the Hebrew people seem to have that kind of mentality that they are followers. I think the term is called sheeple. If you've heard of sheeple. Anyway, those are the people who are uninformed and just follow along. Sheeple. Have you heard of sheeple, Joe?
What's the word?
Sheeple. You mix sheep and people together, and there's people that follow the main crowd and don't even pay attention. Sheeple. You have been informed this morning. So yes, we need to be careful that obviously that's not something that we're doing, but it's something that society is doing today. And chapters 13 and 14, we have the sanctity. We're going to be looking at some different principles. We're going to be looking at the sanctity principle. We're going to be looking at the Sabbath principle, authority principles. But 13 and 14, we talk about a sanctity principle. Chapter 13, verse 1 through 14:27. Sanctity principle. And in verses chapter 13, 1 through 18, we have those who are advocating for rebellion. Those who say, let's go do something else. Let's try something different. those who are advocating for rebellion. And in verses 1 through 5, he talks about a false prophet. Those who would come in, and he says in verse 1, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign wonder comes true concerning that which you spoke, saying, let us go after gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them, he said, you should not listen to them, but you shall actually put them to death, is what he says in verse 5. So this prophet, this dreamer of dreams, and you'll see 3 times where this phrase is repeated, to follow after gods whom you have not known. Whom you have not known. Seeking different paths, different concepts. So verses 1 through 5, we have the false prophet. And if you see a false prophet, they're easy to dismiss, right? You don't really know who this prophet is. Let's just stone him. He's easy to dismiss, somebody you don't know. But the next passage, the next section here, verses 6 through 11, we have this concept of if a relative or a friend. It says, if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is in your own soul, is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, you shall not yield to him. Is that more difficult? Some random prophet, you don't even know his name, he's preaching stupidness, let's just stone him. But here is your own cherished wife. Here is your son and your daughter. Here is somebody you know well. And it says, do not yield to them if they're teaching something other than what you're supposed to be following. Is that more difficult? Can we relate to that? We certainly can. With false prophets, you can just turn that channel, right? You see that big old hairspray do, and they're probably not going to be preaching anything that's gospel. You just turn that channel. But somebody who is your own friend, that's where it's more difficult. I was talking to a guy this week, and he was talking about how he went to the Vatican and he put his hand on Peter's tomb and how it felt so religious. And I didn't really know him. I didn't want to burst his bubble that's probably not Peter's bones. There's like 300 bones in Europe that people claim to be Peter's. And how many bones are in the human body? 206. So just saying it's probably not Peter's bones. It's just some random dried up person they brought over from the Crusades. But anyway, so I didn't know this guy, and I really didn't want to talk to him. I probably should have said, you know what, that is probably not Peter's bones, and just really destroyed his day. But I just didn't want to mess with it. So those kind of people are easy to dismiss, and I probably should have, looking back on it. But what about people that you know? And that's that awkward moment when they're trying to tell you to do something different, and you're like, no, we can't do that. There should be a relationship there that there's open communication, right? And you should be able to talk, but it's difficult sometimes when you care so much about that person, and you think that if I say no, or if I say we can't do this, then it might change our relationship, because we're afraid of rejection. We want the relationship. We value those relationships, right?
But which is more important?
Well, yeah. You stole my thunder, man. But yeah, you're exactly right, Mike. The relationship that's most important is a relationship with God. And sometimes we value that relationship, and we need to value the relationships with those that are closest to us, but we need to value the relationship with God and value them by saying that this is not the right thing we should be doing. Yes, ma'am.
Paul lost a lot of friends by telling the truth.
He did.
Said that'll be your enemy
Yes.
by telling the truth.
Yes, and that's exactly what Christ said. I will turn, father against child and that kind of concept. So houses were divided because of truth. And Paul said, if I become your enemy because I teach you the truth. And so that's going to happen. But we need to realize that We may lose a relationship, or that relationship may change here. But we make sure that we don't change that relationship that we have with God, and start going different ways with the path that we should be on. And so he talks about the relatives, 6 through 11, and then 12 through 18 talks about whole cities. If whole cities, and he says in verse 12, I'm not sure what it has in your version. It says, if you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving to you to live in, anyone saying that some worthless men have gone out from among you and have seduced the inhabitants of the city, saying, let us go and serve other gods whom you haven't known. I like how he says in verse 13, some worthless men start teaching false things. Do you have that? What do you have there? And what's the corrupt? The New American Standard said some worthless men start teaching things that you shouldn't do. He says, if the whole city adopts those things, he says to destroy them, and that all the things that are in that place are under the ban. The ban or contraband was anything that God had said you can't have, and they remember that, or they should remember that, because what's going to happen in AI? What happens in AI when somebody takes something that's under the ban? They lost, because they took it from Jericho, right? He took those silvers and the coats and that kind of stuff and buried it under his tent, and then they went to Ai and they couldn't win because there was contraband in the camp. And so we can't take anything that's under the ban, according to God. So that's a whole city. Chapter 14, 1 through 21, we have practicing abomination, this concept of the things that they cannot do. In verses 1 and 2 it says, don't practice the pagan acts. You are the sons of the Lord your God, and you shall not cut yourselves, nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And he says, don't practice the outward things that the pagans were doing. So apparently these were things the pagans were practicing. It says, you can't do these things. They weren't even to actually trim their beards like the pagans. They were supposed to not trim the corners, is what the Levitical, what it says in Leviticus, which, that doesn't seem like much, right? To trim the little trim around so it doesn't get in the collar, you know what I'm saying? But they're not even supposed to do that. They weren't even supposed to do that, because they were supposed to be distinct. They weren't supposed to do anything that would blend over into halfway looking like some pagan person. Again, why is that important? Why do we have to be distinct? Why do we have to draw lines? Yes. Yes, and that's what he's saying right here. You've got to be holy because you are my chosen people. And there are lines that are black and white. There's no gray area in relationship to how we interact with God. There's not a gray area. And so he says, don't even look like those people. So be careful what you're looking like, is what he's saying here. And then he goes on to talking about dietary laws again, verses 3 through 21, the things they could eat, things they couldn't eat. And so he goes through and says, you shall not, of the unclean things, you shall not eat any of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses. And so he goes talking about that again. So if you want a refresher on the Jewish dietary laws, 3 through 21 will give you that. An interesting thing in verse 21, actually, and towards the end of 21, he says, you shall not eat anything which dies of itself, which is pretty good, right? Some animal's walking along, all of a sudden it falls over dead. You have no idea why. Let's eat that. I don't think so. I don't think I'd do that, actually. You may give it to the alien who is in your own town. Let's give it to those guys. What? Yeah, so sell it on the cheap to those guys, right? So that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. Give it to those people. That's so funny. For you are a holy people, you can't do this. And here's another little thing. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. I was just going to do that. Not really. That doesn't seem like something that, from what I understand, that's possibly something that was in connection with, again, pagan worship of that time, some sort of fertility practice. That was because, like the Ashtarim, when you read about the Ashtarim, that's like a female pagan god for fertility. So that may have been something that was connection with that particular practice. Incidentally, in I believe it's in certain parts of India, that's still a taboo practice. I was watching, those food channel things. They had taboo foods or whatever, and that was one of them, was eating a young goat like that. So anyway, just really weird, but I thought it was kind of interesting that you can't eat a dead animal that's died. Just give it to the foreigners. Give it to them. Verses 22 through 27, we are dedicating the produce. I can't even read my own writing here. I'm talking about the tithe again and what's involved in that. It's something that we've gone over before, but they're talking about what they're supposed to do. In verse 27, you shall not neglect the Levite who is in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance among you. So he's saying you can do whatever you want, you can buy whatever you want. In verse 26, you may spend your money for whatever your heart desires, but don't neglect the Levite. Don't neglect those who are dedicated to the service of the Lord. They don't have any land, so don't forget those guys. And then in 15, 1 through 6, talking about a section of blessings from God in the sabbatical year. We start talking about this in verse 28, this sabbatical principle. How many of you have heard of people taking a sabbatical? In the professional, I'll take a sabbatical. That'd be kind of fun, wouldn't it? I don't think the things leading up to taking a sabbatical would be fun necessarily, because typically people who take a sabbatical are stressed beyond measure and need to take a sabbatical. Is everything all right? You guys can't talk. I'm trying to teach. Y'all are acting up. No, I was playing. So when you're taking a sabbatical, that you need to, here's some sabbatical laws that you might want to keep in mind. It says, at the end of every third year, verse 28, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year, and shall deposit it in your town. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien, the orphan, and the widow who are in your town shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. I find it interesting that as a society, they were to take care of the widow and the orphan. Does that interest you at all? It does me, because God is saying, I'm the God who takes care of these people, and you're going to do it for me. Right? You're going to do that. So he puts in the laws for these people, here's how you're going to take care of the widow and the orphan. And so this chapter 14, 28 through 16, 17, we have this concepts we're talking about the sabbatic year. And he says in verse 15:1, at the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever is of yours is with your brother. And I kind of see that passage in there, somebody holding on to it, and then, I got to release it, He says, your hand will release. You got to let it go. You can't hang on to it on that 7th year. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land. So here's the concept that if you are doing what God has told you to do, the land will be blessed. The land will be fruitful, and there will be no poor person among you, because you're doing what God has told you to do, and that is the right situation. That's the ideal situation. There will be no poor among you, right? But in case, verse 7, the laws for the poor, if there are poor, or for whatever may come up, because God knows that they're not always going to do what is right. And in verse 7 he says, if there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, if any of your towns in your land which you, Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from the poor, from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. And then he says down here a little bit later, if you don't do this, that he may cry to the Lord or make an appeal to the Lord, and it will be a sin to you if you do not. And so this is in relationship to how they were to take care of the poor in their land at that time. And he says in verse 11, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. And it's interesting that we see that here, but we see that take place in the New Testament. When do we see this principle in play, in action in the New Testament? Barnabas, what about in the...
Divided with people.
He sold, so Barnabas sold his property and divided it with his people, with the people. In Acts 2, what happens towards the end of Acts 2? All those people were baptized, 3,000 were baptized, and I'm sorry? They're selling their goods. They had all things in common. They were taking care of their brethren. They were taking care of those people. And so that principle that we see here, they put in practice there as far as taking care of themselves, taking care of each other. And we are to take care of each other as well in relationship to the things that people need. We have some slavery laws that are given to us here also beginning in 12 through 18, we have some laws of slavery. If you want to write out beside that also Exodus 21, 2 through 11, Exodus 21, 2 through 11, and Leviticus 25, 39 through 45. You'll also see where we've covered this kind of information before in relationship to this. And so he talks about slavery. And down in verse 16, I'm talking about releasing them. He says, it shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you, then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also you shall do likewise to your maidservant. Where have you heard this before? In a song, right? Pierce my ear, O Lord, take me to your door this day. I will serve no other gods. We sing that song, and this is where it comes from. If you've decided that you're not going to serve any other master, and you've decided that it's well with you to stay with this master, they will take you to their doorpost and pierce your ear in their door, and you are there with them for the rest of your life. That's a beautiful concept, and if we see that in our relationship to God also, we sing that song. And so here's where that song comes from, pierce my ear. And so this is where that passage, that concept comes from. Verses 19 through 23, 19, we have this concept of the firstborn animals that are consecrated to God, something that we've seen several times in the Old Testament up to this point. So we will not take time to go into that. But the lame or the blind or those kind of things really are not anything God wants. So that's basically going over that again. Chapter 16, we have our annual feasts are again gone over. And it's interesting, in this section, we're not given all of them, we're giving just several of them, and we're given 3. So we have the Passover, 1 through 8, verses 1 through 8. We have the Feast of Weeks, verses 9 through 12. And we have the Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tabernacles, 13 through 15. And so he goes over those again in this section. I told you we'd fly through this. This is, not anything that we're going to take the time to read all of these things. But he goes over this also. And he tells you why they're supposed to do it. You are to remember. Again, this concept of remembering. These are things to remember, these solemn assemblies. Chapter 16, verse 18 through 18:22, we have this authority principle. We begin to look at figures of authority. And in 16:18 through 17:18, we have the judge. 16:18, and he says in verse 18, "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to the tribes. And you shall not," in verse 18, "you shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you." So a message to the judges, a warning: do not pervert justice. Do not pervert justice. And so the judges, the concept of what they're supposed to do, are given to us 16:18 through 17:13. 17:13. And then you have the concept of the king, 17:14 through 17:20. And this is interesting that he would give us this information. He says, "When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, you say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations who are round about me.'" Where do we hear that? Do they end up doing that? Yes, they do. It's interesting that God would know that. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 5, it's interesting that God would know they were going to do that. So they get in there and they have, a period of the judges. And then they start looking around the other nations. Like, oh, you know what? It'd be really cool if we had a king. That would be kind of neat. Because we want to be like everybody else. I mean, who doesn't want to be like everybody else? That's another story altogether. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it, and you want a king, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply herds for... Okay, this is something very important to pay attention to in relationship to how kings act later on. He says, "You shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said, 'You shall never again return that way.' He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself." Man, we're falling down here. We know some kings that did that, right? We know some kings that did that. "Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him that he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord who is God, his God, by carefully observing all the words of the law and the statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, that it may not turn aside from the commandment of the Lord to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel." So here are some things that he's supposed to do. When they decided they want a king, these are the things that they are supposed to do, how they are supposed to act in relationship to being a king. And so there are people out there, higher critics, who want to say that, well, Deuteronomy, this is a reason why Deuteronomy was written much later during the kingdom of Josiah, because they were specifically citing the acts of kings that were not appropriate. And so this is why some people say, well, this was written during the time of Josiah when they supposedly found the law. This was the law they were supposedly found. We know that not to be true. We know Jesus quoted this as scripture and the apostles, so that's not to be true. But this is one passage where they would cite that as the case. Just because God knows that it's going to happen does not mean that it's written later. Does that make sense? And just because God knows it's going to happen doesn't mean He made you do it. Anyway, I'm not going to quote the Matrix on that. But anyway, just because somebody knows that something's about to happen and tells you that it's about to happen does not mean that they made you do that. And so we're going to finish here real quickly Chapter 18, we have the priest, verse 1 through 8. The priest, and then 9 through 22, basically 9 through the rest of the chapter, you have the prophet. And we may go over those just briefly next week. But that finishes out that section on principles of authority. And then we'll get into cities of refuge and some other laws. And we go through, Book of Deuteronomy kind of ebbs and flows with laws and that kind of stuff. And so we're kind of getting bogged down into a law section. But we'll get out of this later on. Yes?
I think it's important to note that the recurring theme is that if you do what I say, then I will bless you.
Yes.
Today, people don't think obedience.
Yeah.
Grace is free, you don't do anything,
Yeah.
you don't have to be obedient. But he has a recurring theme through the whole Bible that says, if you do this, then I will do that.
Yes, and that's very true. That throughout Deuteronomy and the whole Bible, God has not changed. It's the if this, then that principle, which the law of causality. It's going to happen. That's how it works. And so that, later on, people say, well, that's righteousness by works. No, it's righteousness by doing what God told you to do. Just do it, okay? So anyway, yes, it's not all just feels. We got to do some stuff too. All right. Thank you very much for your time this morning.